My name's Kevin Kenny. I know most of you, and if I haven't met anyone, welcome to Glaxman Ireland House. I am the director here. I'm going to be very brief. I'm actually holding my phone to remind you to turn off your phones during the lecture, which we often forget to do. This evening's event will be recorded. It's such a tremendous honor for me to briefly kick things off this evening because it's the annual O'Malley lecture endowed by Cormac O'Malley, the President Emeritus of our advisory board here at Glaxman Ireland House and one of our most active, dedicated and imaginative board members. Thank you, Cormac. My colleague Marion Casey will have a few more words to say about Cormac this evening. So we've been looking forward to this event all semester. It's actually the last event of our calendar this spring. So we do things here every Thursday evening, and please come back in the fall. So Marion Casey, my colleague, traditionally introduces the Ernie O'Malley lecture. It's the 26th in the series. Had the honor of delivering one of them myself. I think it was in 2012. I was just looking at Marion's notes. And Marion will also introduce this year's lecturer, Damian Shiels. The lecture will run for about 45 minutes. We love to have conversations in this house, so we'll throw things open. Damien, if you'll take questions for maybe half an hour, and then we'll invite everybody to join us downstairs for a reception to continue the conversation. So without further ado, Marion, I'll introduce you, or I'll welcome you to the podium. What can I say to introduce Marion Casey, the leading historian of Irish, the Irish and New York, as you put it today, Marion. So welcome.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kevin. Welcome, everybody. As Kevin said, this is a very special night always in our academic calendar year, the annual O'Malley Lecture. This is the 26th one, and we are very grateful to Cormac O'Malley for endowing it. I'm just going to read the rationale that Cormac wrote. It's named in honor of his father. We shorten it to the O'Malley Lecture, right? But it really is the Ernie O'Malley Lecture Series in Irish American history, and that's intentional. So Cormac described his motivation as to honor a man, his father, who challenged his own society in his time and asked why it could not be altered and improved. In his case, his Ireland was changed utterly through the efforts of people like himself and others who wanted something not then available to them. This lecture series was intended to challenge by way of supplementing the existing academic curricula for Irish studies at New York University and to set forth questions in connection with this new departure. More specifically, the lecture series was to deepen both scholarly and public understanding of the Irish role in American history from colonial times to the present. And speaking from personal experience and in just reviewing the list of speakers who have come, and Damien is our 26th, we have plowed a very deep furrow and created a field called Irish American Studies. And I'm really, really proud of Glaxman Ireland House, and I'm very honored and thankful to Cormac for the vision. I've been following Damien's work online for many years, and I only met him for the first time today, although we met virtually as he generously zoomed in from a very stormy night in Cork. where the internet was wobbly, to talk about Ireland's World War I American war brides. And Damien's interests range very widely. Damian Shiels is a postdoctoral fellow, Damian Shiels is a postdoctoral research fellow at Northumbria University in Newcastle in England, where he currently works on the Civil War Blue Jackets Digital Humanities Project. In 2010, he founded the award-winning website www.irishamericancivilwar.com, which primarily focuses on using military records to explore the social impact of the Civil War on Irish people and communities. I mean, I can tell you from experience, he brings it alive through the personal perspective of the soldiers in uniform. The Irish experience of the conflict has been the topic of two of his previous books, The Irish in the American Civil War, 2014, and The Forgotten Irish Immigrant Experiences in America, 2016. Tonight, we have the pleasure of the very first American launch, or maybe the first launch in the world, of his new book, Green and Blue, Irish Americans in the Union Military, 1861 to 65, from LSU Press, hot off the press, 2025. It uses 1,100 newly identified letters written by enlisted Irish American men to explore how they experienced the American Civil War. Kevin mentioned that he gave one of these lectures, and in fact, that's the last time we had this American Civil War as a topic, and Kevin spoke on Abraham Lincoln and the Irish in 2012. Beyond his Civil War research, Damien also specializes in public history and conflict archaeology. He was one of the curators of the National Museum of Ireland's Soldiers and Chiefs Permanent Military History Exhibition and has directed archaeological research projects on Irish battlefield and conflict sites ranging from the medieval period through to the Irish Civil War. He flew in yesterday from his home in Finland, so we welcome him, traveled a long way for this. And I am delighted to welcome Damian Shiels to the Ireland House podium to deliver the 26th O'Malley Award. Lecture.
Thanks a million, Marion, for the kind words. And yeah, it's great to get an opportunity to speak to you here tonight and to join such an illustrious list of speakers. I'm very grateful to everyone for it. I tend to watch these because I spend most of my time obviously in Finland and Ireland. I tend to watch these things on YouTube, so I'm used to seeing the two different rooms and everything. So it's nice to actually be in the room. But yeah, I'll just kick straight in because I'm conscious that I tend to drone on a bit, and I don't want to drone on tonight because Kevin will hook me off the stage. So I want to begin this evening the way the book begins, with the story of a private called Patrick Dooley. He was a native of Clonmel in County Tipperary, and you might have heard of the project he worked on. It kind of became a bit of a big deal afterwards. Central Park, that was what he was at in 1861. He was a stonemason there. But he left that job that summer to enlist in the Union military. Just over a year later, on the 1st of July, 1862, he found himself on the Virginia Peninsula, approaching the battlefield of Malvern Hill outside Richmond. A few days afterwards, he wrote to his mother to describe all he had experienced. He recalled the landscape as a, quote, large open country abounding with corn and fruit, where the wheat was in stacks. It was an environment, he said, that reminded him of the, quote, old country. He regaled her with details of the scene as the United States military formed up for the battle to come, with its different banners fluttering in the breeze. He described how, of all those banners, the one most admired by the assembling Union Army was the old green flag of the Irish Brigade, under whose folds its most cheerful leader, Thomas Francis Meagher, was, quote, admirably gazed upon by all the Yankees. He looked splendid. When he'd finished recounting details of the battle to her, Patrick offered an account and report on the Irish performance to his mother. He said, quote, all our Irish regiment took a most prominent part in the fight and suffered severely. The splendid 9th Massachusetts Regiment lost severely. Also the Irish Brigade and the 37th Irish Rifles and other Irish regiments. So all these ethnic green flag regiments. Patrick Dooley gushed about the performance of the Irish Brigade and the other ethnic Irish regiments because then, as now, they were seen as the primary public representatives of Irish ethnicity in the Union military. And you can see some of them in the building here, some of those representations. They were what the ethnic Irish American newspapers wrote about. They were what Irish American community leaders spoke about. And in the fullness of time, it was their story, that ethnic regimental story, that would become the de facto story for all Irish American participation in the American Civil War. And so it remains today. If you do an Irish-themed tour on a battlefield like Gettysburg, it will be an Irish Brigade tour you do. If you read a book about an Irish leader from the Civil War, it's almost certainly going to be a book about Thomas Francis Meagher. No, I don't think I think there's a law against writing about any of the others. Or Michael Corcoran, anyway. And likewise, when scholars tend to assess the Irish participation in the conflict, naturally, it is to those ethnic green flag units like the Irish Brigade that they turn. And Patrick Dooley would have understood all that, because even in 1862, he recognized that these units stood apart. But there's a problem, is the but. This is why there's a book, I suppose. Because the sole focus on the Irish Brigade and these green flag Irish regiments reveals only one small, albeit important, element of Irish American service in the Civil War. And that's because if you look just at them, you're excluding, in fact, the vast majority of Irish Americans who served in that war, who did not do it in those units. For example, you might be surprised to learn, given what we've just heard about what he was saying at Malvern Hill, one man who did not serve in an ethnic Irish unit was Patrick Dooley. He left his Central Park job not to join Meagher and the Irish Brigade, but the non-ethnic 40th New York Infantry Regiment. So it's reincorporating this silent Irish American majority, the men beyond the folds of the green flags, if you like, into our study and our perception of Irish American Civil War service is the primary focus of the book. Another one is to try and reach past the words we hear so much of Irish officers, Irish community leaders, the speeches that were given, to try and find the voices of the enlisted rank and file working class Irish from cities like New York, soldiers like Patrick Dooley, whose voices have lain largely silent and largely unheard across the past 160 years. That silence has been there not for the want of trying from scholars who look at the Civil War Irish. It's been there because of a lack of source survival. There are very few enlisted Irish American letters that are known about. So then, how do you find them? It's unfortunately in the melancholy fate of men like Patrick Dooley that we've finally been provided with a key to unlocking this ordinary enlisted Irish American experience of the US greatest conflict. Because less than 1 month after he wrote those words about Malvern Hill, Patrick Dooley was dead. Like the majority of fatalities in the Civil War, he fell not to a bullet or to a shell, but to disease, succumbing to typhoid fever contracted in camp. When his mother later applied to the government for a pension based on her son's service, the pensions that are colloquially known as the widow's pensions, she included her son's wartime letters as evidence of his financial support. An assessment of tens of thousands of these files in search of Irish American correspondence, as Marion was alluding to earlier, has yielded the letters that form the integral part of this book. So ultimately it produced 1,432 letters relating to 568 Irish American men, the largest single body of Irish American wartime correspondence yet identified. And they are representative of the entire military. They served in more than 260 distinct units in every theater of war in which the United States was engaged. And a key element, 98% of them relate to men who served in the enlisted ranks. So these then are the common soldiers and sailors of the conflict for Irish America. Their letters tell us how they experienced the war, what they thought about life in camp and on the battlefield, how they interacted with religion, race, and politics. They also shed light on how they saw themselves and the cause for which they were fighting. I'm not going to go into any details on the widow's pensions tonight, but I'm always happy to talk about them for 7 to 8 or 10 hours if you want to talk about it later on. So don't worry about that. I'm going to spend the majority of our time this evening touching on some of what the letters themselves reveal. But first, I do want to briefly begin by discussing some of the facts and figures relating to Irish American service, because there's some corrective needed. Contrary to long-held historical opinion, for example, Irish Americans were not underrepresented in the United States military during the Civil War. In fact, they actually appear to have served at slightly higher levels than the proportion of the population in the North. A conservative estimate places the number of Irish-born men in US service at around 180,000. To this, we have to add a further 70,000 Canadian, British, and American-born children of Irish immigrants. We know from the large body of fine scholarship that's been produced on Irish America, and a lot of it has come from this room, it has to be said, that the Irish in the United States at this period were an ethnically cohesive lot. I have some examples shown in this slide that shows you how cohesive they could be. These foreign-born men often saw themselves and were seen by others as an intrinsic part of the ethnic Irish-American community. So this leaves us then with a total figure for what I would regard as Irish-American service of some 250,000 men. These 250,000 individuals shared many ethnic traits and community backgrounds, but they were also diverse within themselves with differing life experiences. The popular image of the Irish soldier of the American Civil War is of the recently arrived famine immigrant, and many of them were that. But there were also many who arrived here before the famine occurred. There were those who came during the war itself. There were men who had left Ireland as adults, and there were those who'd grown to manhood entirely in the United States, Britain, or Canada. Neither were they all Catholic. Thousands of Irish Anglicans and Presbyterians also served the United States. As we might expect, the vast majority joined the military from the urban heartlands of Irish America, and particularly the Atlantic seaboard. And again, it would be of no shock to you that nowhere rivaled New York in this regard. Over 51,000 Irish-born men enlisted in volunteer regiments alone, so just volunteer regiments serving in the infantry and artillery and cavalry, almost 3 times the number from the next largest state, which was Pennsylvania. And if you're interested in who comes bronze in this, it's the state of Massachusetts. So you see that focus in these areas. But they weren't just in those volunteer regiments. They were the dominant immigrant group, and sometimes just the dominant group in the professional United States regular army. During the bombardment of Fort Sumter, which opened the Civil War, there were more Irish-born soldiers than American-born soldiers in the garrison when it happened. And the first 2 men killed were both Irish immigrants. Almost 40% of the United States regular army at the start of the American Civil War had been born in Ireland. Not Irish American, now born in Ireland. 20% of the United States Navy estimated as born in Ireland as well during the course of the war. So again, you're seeing the mass scale of this event. The heavy concentration of Irish Americans in volunteer units from New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts also had a bearing on where most Irish fought the war. So they were significantly more prevalent in the Eastern theater than in the West. So Gettysburg, Antietam, the Fredericksburgs, serving in formations like the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James. They're the highest concentrations of Irish. And again, we currently tend to assess the impacts of these famous battles like Antietam and Fredericksburg and Gettysburg through the lens of the Irish Brigade, as I was mentioning, and the ethnic regiments. But I would say we need to reorientate those concepts and consider them from the perspective of losses sustained on those battlefields by urban regiments. Not looking at ethnicity, looking at their urban nature. Because whenever an urban unit from any one of those states suffered on a battlefield of the American Civil War, there was a stream of casualty and death notifications pouring back into Irish American communities. There's one other feature of Irish American service I want to highlight before we begin exploring these men's correspondence, and we will get to it, I promise. But that's their class profile. Although most of the historiographical discussion surrounding Irish service in the war focuses consistently and sometimes only focuses on their ethnic background, their overwhelming working class background played an equally important role in shaping their experience and how they were perceived by others. And this is something too that wasn't just from the outside looking in. There was class distinctions within Irish American communities as well. There's a couple of examples on the quotes here on this slide. It's another thing to consider when we think that Irish American officers can always act as proxies for what the enlisted men thought. They were often the same, but they were not always the same. They didn't always share the same social position. So what then of the wartime experiences of these Irish American enlisted men? Much of what they wrote about, complained about, and celebrated bears comparison to nearly all other letters that you get from soldiers north and south. They grumbled incessantly about the weather. They complained all the time, and it didn't matter if the person was illiterate or not, the people weren't writing to them from home. They lamented the ever-increasing cost of tobacco. They described military movements and life in camp, and they ruminated on how well or badly they were adapting to soldiering. There's no evidence in any of their correspondence for this exceptional lust for combat, this idea of fighting Irish that you often hear as a stereotype. But the majority did expect that the guy standing next to them on the battlefield would do their duty. And if they didn't, they would write about it. And they would particularly write about it if the guy next to him was another Irish American from his own community. For all the similarities of their experience to that of other Civil War soldiers, there were some notable points of difference. One of them revolved around religion. The vast majority of Irish American troops were Catholic, but despite the huge numbers of men of that faith in the US military, there were only 53 Catholic chaplains known to have served during the Civil War. So the chances were that if you served outside an ethnic regiment, you would not encounter a priest during your time at the front. In the absence of that direct connection to the clergy, men turned quite a lot to physical sacramentals, so especially things that could be worn around the neck, like scapulars and Agnus Dei. These items were important for the devout, but they also took on the function of protective talismans. So one of them, as an example, was sailor John Sullivan, who in 1863 described for his mother the measures he took to strengthen his resolve. And I quote, "I have this Agnus Dei next to my heart, mother, and pictures of you and my dear little brothers, which will give me courage through every battle," spelled B-A-T-T-L-L. John Doherty of the Irish Brigade said that when what he called the small articles he wore, quote, "gave me a feeling of safety in the time of danger. When the shells was busting over us and the bullets flying thick around, I felt perfectly safe." Most of the men obtained those items from home. So, for example, telling his mother he had not forgotten his, quote, "duty to God and the Blessed Virgin," US Marine Peter Campbell requested she send a scapular to wear. Get it blessed before you send the scapular. Okay, so this is a constant refrain from these men. Of course, the most important interactions for many of the men during the war was with those who were most often sending them these items, their families on the home front. There were many important facets to that relationship, but one of the most crucial interactions was the sending home of money. And I just want to concentrate on that element of it tonight to help sustain those families when they were away. The economic precarity of many Irish Americans is something that consistently shines through, both in the correspondence and in the pension files. People relying on rental accommodation, people who are used to moving up and down through the spectrum of employment. Military wages offered a guaranteed income in certain economic times, but the failure of the federal government to meet the challenge of actually paying the men on time caused huge problems for thousands of Irish Americans. And I'll just give you one example. This is a Rochester Irishman, John Hayes, who was serving in the 105th New York Infantry. And in 1862, he received word that his wife, Honora, had died in Rochester shortly after giving birth to twin girls. At the time of the delivery, she had been weakened by, quote, utter want, owing to the fact that John, quote, did not earn $5 all winter. He had got no pay yet for his soldiering. Honora had been forced to move to cheaper accommodations just prior to giving birth, and had only avoided the poorhouse due to the intercession of an aunt. At the front, the newly widowed John learned of his wife's fate at the same time he was told that 5 of his children had been placed in different institutions, and orphan asylums. So that is what you could be dealing with. For their part, those at home weren't shy in letting servicemen know of their struggles. In early 1864, this man on the left, Kieran Phelan of the 11th Connecticut Infantry, received a letter from his wife, Elizabeth, that couldn't have failed to shake him. In a demonstration of how word spread fast among the Irish American community as well as everywhere else, Elizabeth had become aware that, quote, the men all got paid down there, for all the women around here got their money. But she had got nothing. Elizabeth was desperate. Their son Willie was dying of the lung fever, and she had been forced to keep burning their limited fuel through the night. You normally wouldn't burn it at night. Quote, I ain't got as much wood as will do me another week, she told her husband. Angered at Kieran's apparent neglect, she raged, quote, how do you suppose that I can get along, or do you care for 3 little children and a woman left to the waves of the world? To reinforce the seriousness of their plight and pile pressure on her husband to act, she added, quote, what I'll do, I don't know if you don't send me some money very soon, adding for emphasis, right quick. The pressure of financial responsibilities towards those at home could depress morale and even led to desertion. In fact, this type of economic hardship was far more likely to cause desertion than any of the ideological things that we might think of when we're thinking about Irish American troops. But the money they earned in uniform also had the capacity to provide servicemen with a sense of self-worth, of pride, and of achievement. So, for example, despite fretting over delays with his pay, Kerry native John Sullivan of the 99th New York adopted that outlook as he and his family worked towards increasing their financial security. Pleased that his mother had been offered a position that would allow her to, quote, live rent-free, so presumably she was a domestic, he looked forward to putting his future pay towards buying furniture so that they could, quote, have a nice home when I return and commence a new life. Thomas Hagan told his mother he intended to use his pay to, quote, try and buy a place to live instead of paying rent. P-A-I-N is paying. While John Kennedy informed his family they would have a nice little farm as a result of his service. John Sheehan had put another $100 into his father's account saying, quote, I think I've done as well for you the past year as I've ever done. And when he increased that to $225, he said, I think the place must be pretty near paid for its time you was building a house. So you can see this sort of motivation. Maintaining their central role in the financial management of the home allowed Irish American servicemen to preserve their relevance and importance despite their distance. But there is another major challenge I want to discuss that they faced in doing this, and they faced it more than any other identifiable white demographic group in federal service, and that was their literacy levels. By far the most significant obstacle to communicating with home faced by Irish American servicemen stemmed from the unenviable position they had as the least literate major white ethnic group in the United States. We have different figures for illiteracy, but I won't go into them now. It's no doubt that the actual rates are significantly higher than the percentages we have, because we see it consistently when you try and compare the pension files to what they have put on the census about their literacy, that they're not telling the truth about their literacy. They're regularly illiterate when they're saying they're literate on the census. Many Irish servicemen who, like John Brennan in these examples, took their pen in hand were not doing so at all, but they were relying on a scribe or an amanuensis, as it's often called, to convey their words on their behalf. But the lack of distinguishing features, there is no element of these letters that would make you think this guy has not written them himself. So it makes it incredibly difficult for us now to know whether a soldier has directly authored his letters, unless you have a sequence like this where you can see different hands. And even when Irish Americans could themselves read and write, the parents that they were writing to might not have been able to, and often frequently were not. But one of the interesting things that you see is even if everybody's illiterate, they all still expect you to write the letters, and they expect to receive them, and will give out about it if you're not doing it, okay? So that in itself is testament to the communication networks that Irish American communities had established at the time. On those rare occasions where the scribe of an illiterate Irish American serviceman is named in a letter, it's apparent that they consistently chose where they could another Irish American to do it. This type of ethnic cohesiveness, even in mixed units with low numbers of Irish, is something that we just see again and again and again. They sought out their own, someone who they could trust, someone who knew their background. Many of the people who did this had known each other before enlistment, but we know from researching these guys that it didn't matter. If they had no previous relationship, they would do the same. And their bonds that were most frequently exposed in the historical record when a soldier died and other Irish Americans felt a responsibility to communicate that news home. So, for example, when laborer James Connor of the 2nd Massachusetts Heavy Artillery succumbed to death, his family were told that his closest friend was, quote, Dennis Toomey of Lowell, who has been with him all the time since he came out. When John Gannon from County Tipperary was killed in action at Second Bull Run in 1862, his mother received a letter from another Irish American, John Meehan, who told her, quote, I was to him like a brother and him to me. The fact is we both slept and ate together since we first enlisted. Another example, James Maloney of the 31st New York Infantry, none of these are ethnic units, by the way, who stepped up when Stephen O'Shea lost his life at Gaines Mill in June 1862, telling O'Shea's wife he had been, quote, her husband's comrade all the time he was in the army and was at his side when he was killed. I want to turn now to discuss some of the other challenges Irish Americans faced in service. As I'm sure you're all aware, Irish Americans in this period suffered from a wide range of anti-Irish sentiment, and this followed many of them into uniform. Irish American troops were broadly stereotyped during the Civil War. They drank too much, they fought too much, they deserted too much, they weren't very loyal, and so on. There are charges I discuss in the book in more detail, but suffice to say here, to a large degree, much of it was based on nativist and, as I was pointing out earlier, class prejudice. Nativism was present in the Union Army just as it was in society at large. Historian Stephen Ramold has shown that if you were Irish and did the same indiscretion as someone who was native born, it was more likely that the Irish guy would be punished for it. They suffered more severe punishment. But nevertheless, the evidence suggests that by and large, and as long as they didn't step out of line, Irish Americans could navigate service under a nativist officer or a prejudiced officer, particularly as a regiment's esprit de corps, as they kind of went through more together. These officers were willing to see them not just as Irishmen. But the type of low-level prejudice that can sometimes be harder to track in the historical record never dissipated. And I just want to mention a couple of examples of this that I found particularly interesting. The cases of Patrick Carraher and Patrick Kelleher. Patrick Carraher was from Armagh, and he went to war in the 2nd New York State Militia. But he didn't go under his real name. He went under the name John Carrier. He apparently used that name because of its un-Irishness. It had been a coping mechanism he developed in civilian life as a relative later explained because, quote, at the shop where he worked, which was in New York, there was a large number of young men, Americans and English, who would keep calling him Pat and Paddy if he put his name in as Patrick. So he gave his name in as John. So he kept John Carrier as his professional name, he enlisted under it, and he was killed under it at the First Battle of Bull Run. Patrick Kelleher told a similar tale, although it's a bit more complicated story, but effectively he said to his friends that he used the alias John Kelly because he did not want to be called Pat while in the service by his comrades, non-Irish. Okay. But just as Irish Americans faced discrimination, they in turn discriminated against African Americans. Even in a racist society, Irish Americans were noted for the virulence of their antipathy towards blacks, as displayed in events such as the New York City draft riots depicted here. Much of that attitude is borne out in the enlisted correspondence of Irish American men. Those writings demonstrate that regardless of whether they'd lived all their lives in the United States or were relatively recent arrivals, the great majority of Irish American servicemen regarded black people, and particularly enslaved black people, as their inferiors. When Edward Carroll signed off a letter to his County Monaghan parents back in Rhode Island from Virginia in 1861, the last news he shared with them was of how the African Americans he met, and in none of these occasions where I say African American, that's not the word they use. Okay, so you get, were just like dogs. They will come when you whistle. They will run after you like a dog. It's apparent that encountering the enslaved was something completely beyond many Irish Americans' experience, a novelty that was newsworthy for those at home. Most Irish Americans appear to have subscribed to the commonly held view that slavery had further degraded the people subjected to it, placing the enslaved at the very bottom of their conceived racial hierarchy. Importantly, in large part, the men's correspondence indicates that they fundamentally believed in their own white supremacy. There's always a bit of a discussion, I think less so these days in fairness, but they fundamentally believe it. And there are indications that many of them carried that belief with them from Ireland, in my view. It wasn't just all learned in the United States. The views of Michael Daly, a Limerick immigrant in the 7th Illinois Cavalry, capture something of the view. In the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation, it was apparently suggested to him by his brother that he might be able to secure a farm if he married an African-American woman. He provided a fairly unequivocal response. About the farm and the African-American wife, the farm would do very well without the wife. I go in too strong for my own color. Give me one from the old sod. He actually later spoke about importing a wife from Ireland, so it shows you where he stood on the kind of the women generally. Yet for all this, it's important not to overstate the degree to which the views many Irish Americans held towards African Americans influenced their support of the war. Incidents such as the New York City draft riots, which had such a strong Irish component, have been interpreted in Civil War history as signifying a broad Irish American turn against the war in the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation. But it's important to remember that the majority of New York Irish did not participate in the New York riots, and racial animosity was only one element of those riots. Neither is there any compelling evidence that Irish Americans in service abandoned the Civil War after the Emancipation Proclamation was declared. And even further to this, we have a lack of work that's been done on late war soldiers from 1863 on. But what evidence we do have suggests that Irish Americans were actually proportionately more willing to enlist late in the war than native-born white Americans were. So you're more likely to see Irish Americans. That's in large part because of the financial inducements on offer, which were even sufficient to bring large numbers of men directly from Ireland with the express intent of joining the Union Army. And I can't let this pass, of course, without the enormous influence. I do love the film, it's a great film, but that Gangs in New York has had a mass influence on this, enormous, because of that scene of kind of these dopey Irish people wandering around going, what are we doing? And then they're thrown on a boat. We see again and again and again that they're coming intentionally to enlist because it's life-changing money. And I will say in relation to the Emancipation Proclamation, frequently we see men who are virulently opposed to Emancipation Proclamation and do not like African Americans. And they're doing things like re-enlisting as veteran volunteers. They are not abandoning the war after this. I'm not saying this is everybody's view, but it happens quite consistently. And this was the case even though the overwhelming majority of Irish Americans were very faithful adherents to the Democratic Party, and many actively disliked Republicans and President Abraham Lincoln. For example, during the 1864 presidential election between Lincoln and Democratic nominee George McClellan, who was former Army of the Potomac commander, and the Irish adored George McClellan. They adored him. It was pretty apparent who Irish American servicemen hoped would win. This is one of my favorite quotes from this. A Dubliner who was down in Acapulco, not on holiday, he was on the USS Cyan. But he was pondering if old Abe will be re-elected or will some other unknown broken down lawyer take his place. Charles Taylor, a trainer who was a member of the Irish Brigade and had re-enlisted as a veteran, predicted on 1st of November 1864 that the election would be a hard contest. But he earnestly hoped that little Mac McClellan will be the man. But again, these are Democrats who apparently were all supposed to be against the war. They're staying in service. They're staying democratic, they're staying in service. The assassination and martyrdom of Lincoln and democratic opposition to emancipation has caused the Irish-American wartime political stance to be increasingly marooned on the wrong side of history in popular perception. But an exploration of the reality of their lives and the society in which they lived makes their position and even the virulent racism they all too often practiced entirely comprehensible. The Republican Party, with its anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic component, wasn't their friend. Neither were radical abolitionists. And they saw enslaved people in a racist society. Even Abraham Lincoln was racist in this period, you know, as a massive threat. So it appears Irish Americans apparently had a shopping list as long as your arm as to why they shouldn't enlist in the American Civil War. We've gone through many of the reasons before. But 250,000 of them serve. So what's going on? I'm going to kind of bring it to a conclusion by exploring their motivations, but I do want to briefly return to the point I made at the start of the talk about how when we are just able to focus on the green flag, ethnic units and the top-down level, what we get from that. And what it kind of promotes, if you like, is an Irish exceptionalism. These people are just thinking about Ireland all the time. It's all Ireland, Ireland, Ireland. There's no America. But it paints a different picture when you look at the broader number of enlisted men. We see them talking about the 4th of July. They mention it way more than they ever mentioned St. Patrick's Day. They talk about sending money home for Thanksgiving. They talk about visiting Washington's grave. They talk about seeing where historic events happened, where Cornwallis surrendered. We see that type of fused identity everywhere. For example, by the time young Cork immigrant Patrick Duggan entered federal service, his home wasn't Ireland, it was Wilmington, Illinois. He asked about all the Wilmington boys, all the boys from Wilmington Parish, who from Wilmington got killed. He's specifically referring to Irish guys in Wilmington, but it's not all Irish, Wilmington Irish he's interested in. Patrick Horan from Galway, whose father died in Ireland during the famine, updated his mother on all the Rochester boys. Dubliner John Mahon, interested in all the boys from Hudson. Kilkenny immigrant Jeremiah Keenan, the Churchville boys, on and on and on it goes. It's apparent from these men's letters, and many of them expressed it almost the moment they stepped off the boat. There's some examples on this slide. That once they emigrated, they came to see America and not Ireland as their country. That's further borne out by the relationships they maintained with the old country. For while a longing for home, as we know, was a major motif of Irish American culture, as was the cause of Irish freedom, the great majority of these men had absolutely no intention of ever returning to Ireland to live. And for that matter, of ever going back to fight the British there. Their primary concerns were in remitting money back to Ireland so that they could continue the process of transposing their Irish communities from Ireland into the new American Irish communities on this side of the Atlantic, the country that offered them the opportunity. So then when considering motivations, we have to first recognize these men's relationship with the United States. They were committed to the American Republic, to the Union, and had come to view themselves not just as Irish or even as Irish American, but as American Irish, of which there's a good book you should read with that title. So the last element then, just to talk about their motivations. And I'm going to just look, this is the last slide, by looking at John White, who was from Templemore in County Tipperary. And his journey began with his father's death in Ireland during the famine. In the wake of that, his mother moved her young family to East Hampton, Massachusetts. And it was in the United States where John grew to manhood. He was 15 when the war began, and so it was late 1863 before he enlisted into the 2nd Massachusetts Heavy Artillery at age 17. Why did he enlist? It's clear from his correspondence he had a deep affection for his community, the laboring community around Nashawanuck Mills. I'm sure I'm absolutely mangling that pronunciation, in Massachusetts. He consistently inquired after the welfare of the button shop boys and girls he used to work with and of his employer. Maybe that fostered a sense of patriotism. He said, if I be shot, I will die in a good cause. You may be sure I will kill a few Rebs before I go, if I be spared. But maybe he was trying to prove his manhood. He spoke disparagingly about another local boy, Charlie Smith, who he said liked to blow about what he can do, but in the end had decided to stay at home with the girls, where he'd have to hang his head, the coward. But maybe it was economics. He was making $13 a month in the factory, the same as he'd get in the army, but he was also entitled to all these bounties. And so he says to his mother that his biggest desire was for her to, quote, build a house. And he would do all I can to help you along with it. I want a house that we can call our own when I go home, so you might as well go about it as quick as you can. All of these quotes show the challenges and the pitfalls when you're trying to assign a singular motivation for why an individual would enlist in a war like the Civil War. Any of those quotes, or none of them, could be the main reason why John White enlisted. But the assessment of these men from across the breadth of the Union military does show two shining out, and that is economics and patriotism. From the economic perspective, from the first major engagement in the war in 1861 to the last in 1865, there were Irishmen in uniform whose primary impulse to join up had been financial need, financial opportunity, or both. When the first call for volunteers went out in 1861, it came at a time of recession caused by the secession crisis that had impacted Irish America. Massachusetts shoemaking was in the doldrums. Rhode Island textile works were struggling to stay open. Thousands of Philadelphia and New York factory employees had been laid off, these are Irish American jobs. Outlining for his parents why he joined up in July 1861, shoemaker James O'Hearn explained that he had originally left home in search of work, but he could not get any, and so he decided to enlist rather than be a burden on you. Thomas Doyle told a similar story. He said the times began to look very gloomy and dull, and he had not wanted to be dependent upon anyone for his support. Edmund Dwyer, writing to Ireland in 1862, said it was nothing but want of employment that had compelled his friend to enlist, elaborating that he has a helpless family and must provide for it in some manner. Yet it's also apparent that thousands of Irish Americans donned federal uniform because they felt a profound sense of responsibility and duty towards the United States of America. They had a major desire to preserve the Union and the American Republic, one that overrode for many of them any reservations they had about the Republicans or Abraham Lincoln or African Americans or emancipation. Typical of them was Tommy Welsh, a Wexford native who served in the famed 20th Maine Infantry. Anybody's ever watched Gettysburg, Little Round Top? He was in his late 30s when he went to war. He was supporting his elderly parents by doing seasonal log rafting on New Brunswick's Nashwauk River, so moving back and forth across the border. After his full engagement of the war at Fredericksburg in 1862, he wrote that he had trouble and trials, which is a bit of an understated reference to your first battle. But he continued, I bear them willingly and more because the flag that has given protection to persecuted countrymen. That's his way of saying it's protected. Kerry immigrant William Harnett of the 4th US Infantry told his family that if the worst should come, I will only share the fate of many better men. Michael McCormick of the 65th New York Infantry simply put it to his parents, I do not want to go home until this war is over. Then I will be satisfied, but not before. Clare immigrant Martin Noonan was more outspoken. He looked forward to the day when, quote, we will be planting the poles for the glorious stars and stripes to wave over the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Irish Americans may have been among the latest arrivals, but they felt they had already carved out their position and demonstrated their commitment to their new country. Rather than something that they viewed as facilitating their efforts to become American, it's apparent that tens of thousands of these men entered into American Civil War service in the fervent belief that they already were. For such men, enlistment during the Civil War was less of an attempt to prove their worth to the United States and more of a duty they felt morally obliged to perform. They felt this while realizing that many others did not regard them in the same light, and likely while recognizing that a long struggle for acceptance lay ahead. But despite all of that, many of the 250,000 ethnic Irish who fought for the United States did so in the belief that they were fighting for their country, every bit as much as their native comrades who touched elbows with them on the battlefield. And I leave it there. Thanks very much.
Could you comment on the Confederate side in terms of, I mean, 240,000 is a staggering number of Irish-born in the Union Army. There are rumors, and I know you have something to comment about the sing-song between the Fredericksburg brigades and all of that. But thinking, I mean, my limited knowledge is about people going in, the Irish going into New Orleans and various other southern ports, and then signing up, not being necessarily pro-Confederate, but I mean, that's the thing to do. You don't get a job, you need a job, and you get a job.
Yeah, I can. Thanks for the question, Cormac. And I will have to give a shout out to Professor David Gleeson, who's written on the Irish and Confederates, really good book, and he's the main guy on this, and he's done the numbers. So just in numbers, and I think it's an interesting one to do. There were 9 Irish-born men for every 1 Irish-born man in the Union versus the Confederate. That's the disparity, 9 to 1. And of course, that's a population demographic. David's estimates are that 20,000 Irish-born men served in the Confederacy, which is actually a very high number in proportion to the Irish community in the South. And as you were saying, like New Orleans it's the be all and end all of the Irish and the Confederate military. Like the Louisiana units that come out of New Orleans are loaded with Irish. And like the work that David and others have done, like it's not terribly dissimilar. A lot of them are really buying into, you know, where this is our society. You know, we're now the Irish New Orleans. This is what our economy is based off and things like that. David's work has shown, for example, that the Irish, if they got captured or anything, they tended to be a bit more willing to kind of go, oh, okay, it's all over now, than, you know, some kind of dyed-in-the-wool planter was. But they did actually come quite back in strongly in you know, with the lost cause and everything. The Irish in the South were kind of big proponents of that as well. But so it's a complete difference in scale, I suppose, the big thing. So there's a regular, and the Fredericksburg element is about the Irish firing on Irish. The Irish were consistently firing on Irish. Virtually any time the Army in Northern Virginia and the Army of Potomac faced off, there were Irish guys shooting Irish guys. Were Blackburn's Ford, which happens before First Bull Run, Irish against Irish. But it's normally these small levels because you have these urban New York, Philadelphia units up against these kind of companies that might have guys out of Richmond or Savannah or New Orleans. So yeah, there's always that. It's quite similar, I think, in the economics versus patriotism element. Just are the two biggest on both sides of it.
Damien, thanks for this. Really eye-opening. My question is, I find it interesting that one of the compelling reasons that the Irish decided to fight in the war was for an abstraction, the preservation of the Union. And looking at that, that seems kind of quite high-minded for many who are illiterate. And then on top of that, what do the letters reveal anything about their understanding of what the motivation was on the part of the Confederates? Do they speak, the letters speak to that at all?
Yeah, so, and again, to reference somebody else's work, Gary Gallagher has done an incredible book on this, which shows the Union wasn't a high-minded, unusual concept for them. The Union was the country, and they saw it as the country. And I think it's maybe more difficult for us to look back when you start talking. It was actually the reason I called the book Union, which can be a bit controversial as well sometimes today. Because they saw it as their country, and they saw a direct, real threat that trying to secede was destroying the country, that it would destroy it. They saw it as a very simple issue, really, in those terms. And that's the way a lot of guys in the North saw it. So it's more difficult for us, I think, to get our head around that. You know, you can kind of, I think Gary Gallagher talks about this as well, where it's kind of easier to understand the Confederate side of things. You know, we want to expand slavery, we want to keep slavery and keep it going and everything, and seeing their viewpoint than it is to see this kind of abstraction. They don't. Semi-literate letters are interesting in comparison to say the flowery quotes we're used to hearing on Civil War documentaries and in Civil War books. They talk in a more kind of straightforward way. It's to be sure, for example, they can often be, like they'll tell their mothers some fairly horrific stuff about, you know, guys having their brains blown out and stuff like that, because they tend to write in a kind of a very matter-of-fact way. And so it's understated. So they don't really go into like the destruction of what their view, I suppose, of what the Confederates are doing, other than what the Confederates are trying to do is bad. That it's all for them really about the United States. And it makes sense, right? If you think about it, you know, if you want to transpose your community over to the United States, having the country destroyed as they would see it, you're destroying the place that you can do that, and destroying all the opportunities that you have. Like you see in the letters, for example, I haven't touched on it too much there. You see, for example, the consistent move for the next generation to make sure they all stay in school, get educated, that kind of progression. It's all in the letters all the time, you know, so they're seeing that kind of long-term thing, and you need the country to survive for that.
Thank you, Damien, for an amazing presentation. I actually have a direct follow-on from Martin's question about the Union, not as an abstraction, but as a real tangible thing, and a love of their country, their new country, but their now country. And my question is about how the war aims change. So, you know, there's a notorious quote from Lincoln that I'll mangle, but along the lines, if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do so. And if I could save it by freeing none of them, I would do that. And if I could save the Union by freeing some of them, I would do that. So I don't know if you encountered Ian Delahanty's book.
I haven't read it yet, but it's a big pile.
Embracing Emancipation.
Yeah.
Ian was actually my own doctoral student, and I think what Ian is arguing is that as the war aims changed, the Irish came to embrace emancipation, but they did so for the same reason, to save the Union. So when it became apparent that saving the Union would involve the destruction of slavery and the uprooting of that institution and the termination of that institution, Ian would argue that the Irish came on board with anti-slavery, but for the same fundamental reason, which was to save the Union. So really the second half of Martin's question there is, did that play out as an abstraction? It didn't, right? That played out on the ground as something real and tangible.
Yeah, it did. And I mean, I would agree with Ian's conclusions on that. Like that's known to have happened in the Union military as a whole. Like the Union military, by and large, was opposed to emancipation. Most of the generalship was, and huge numbers of the rank and file were. And there's a kind of a view, you know, that and it's been well shown now that a lot of them then decide, well, okay, look, it's helping defeat them. We're taking away this huge economic advantage that the Confederates have with the use of African-American enslaved labor. And I think when you look close, that everything bears that out. You have, at the time when the Emancipation Proclamation is coming out, guys are writing about it. They're going crazy about it, saying this is terrible, this is ridiculous. And then they're re-enlisting. So if they really care that much about it, that, you know, and it's clear they don't like African Americans, but they're re-enlisting because the Union is more important to them. And that's why they're saying, like, there's lots of examples of this. Corcoran's Irish Legion, the entire brigade of Irish guys marches out in New York, more or less just after the Emancipation Proclamation is announced. You know, there's huge numbers of these people going. So I think that is the case. I think they do it to a lesser degree probably than the standard. You know, there's a kind of a standard that they all accept this. So, you know, the army votes largely for Lincoln and stuff, like the Irish don't do that. The Irish stay democratic. But it's that element, and there's good scholarship on it now that's kind of been left out, that the loyal war Democrats who are fully in for the war, they're not looking to make any sort of peace. They want a victory. And I think most of the Irish, certainly guys who are in uniform, a lot of them are viewing that respect. So yeah, I absolutely think that when it comes down to it, the union is more important to them. Their country is more important than any problem they have in relation to.
This is part 3 of this question. Yes. You mentioned during the lecture, Damien, which I've thoroughly enjoyed, thank you so much, about the Catholic material culture, right? And I'm struck that the official position of the Catholic Church was no north, no south, no east, no west, right? So which is the union? Yeah. And so is there any religious dimension to what we were just talking about?
I suppose, to go back to their correspondence, they're not referencing it in that regard. Like, for the men at the front in the enlisted ranks, I think it's as much about what religion can do for them rather than thinking about, you know, the wider, broader elements of what the Catholic Church's view is as a whole. So yeah, like, there's definitely mixed messages coming from a lot of it, from a lot of the kind of senior leadership at that time, and particularly, I mean, they're getting some of their cues in relation to how they view African Americans and stuff off of the church, like. But no, it's really very, I suppose, to bring it back down to the enlisted men, they're interested in the religious stuff for their faith. It's important to their family because of that connection. It's much more practical. That's the thing, I suppose. For these enlisted men, it's practical nearly always seems to supersede the ideology, right? So that's not to say they're not ideological, but practical is so important. And so you see that, like, what the church is to them, and this includes non-Catholic chaplains actually, is things like, that's the way of getting money home. It's a way, if I die, someone is going to be told about it. It's a way of getting the religious articles that if I'm going to be dug up 100 years later and Antietam, I'll have them, you know. So I suppose that's more the side of it that I would stress in relation to that. But the like, certainly I don't think in the broader, with the stance the church took in relation to their views with regard to African Americans, it didn't help. I will just say on the African American thing, I mean, I've never seen it as a very, and just generally the war, but I've never seen it as very difficult to understand. Like, if everybody is racist and everybody effectively is a white supremacist, it's more or less true at this period. If you're the people who think, I have these people who are my inferior, who are economically threatening me, they're not threatening Abraham Lincoln, they're threatening me. I just think it's the perfect breeding ground for incredible anti-African American sentiment. You know, I just think it's really fairly obvious in that regard. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying that. But anyway, sorry, I've gone off on a tangent. As usual, you're getting used to that.
Damien, just wondering if you ran across any instances of hostility within the Irish American community towards Irish Americans who enlisted and served as soldiers. I ask because I know in the anthracite region of Pennsylvania, there were many instances. There were quotes where, like, you know, when people were talking about Irish Americans who had enlisted, you know, there's a quote like, "We don't own them as Irish anymore." There were instances where people were killed, you know, when they were home on leave. And I know that things in the anthracite region were kind of peculiar and maybe not representative. You know, the Molly Maguires are being born. And I'm just wondering if you ran across anything like that anywhere else.
Yeah, so in terms of their correspondence, they're not really talking about that. I mean, there's no question that's the case. It's such a gigantic community. There's plenty of people who weren't interested in it. One of the things you'll see them say quite a bit is that they'll make a reference to not being steady when they're talking to their parents or something. And I think that's sometimes a reference to maybe they're going, what are you doing in the war? And that's the phrase they use. I thought he was too steady to enlist, like, you know, kind of reliable, or wouldn't do it, wouldn't be so foolish. But they rarely make any discussion about, you know, people. In fact, in none of the letters do they do it. It's a much smaller scale. So their family will be telling them, buddy, come back, desert, desert, desert. And some of them have deserted and like they'll say, I'm not deserting again. Like, already come back. And I got caught and now I'm back in the army. But so they're not referencing it too much. They do talk about the draft riots, for example. Guys talk about that, but they don't put any, there's no mention, for example, that there's an Irish dimension to it. They're saying, have you seen the muss that's going on in New York? There's another letter that references, like, if these, now he isn't specifically talking about the draft riots, but I think he is referencing it. It's another similar event, but he's saying, if these guys want to go off and like be shooting bullets at police officers, why don't they come out here and help us win the war? So a lot of guys, it doesn't take them very long in service, I think, to have a very kind of distinct view of what most of them are doing. You know, they don't have much time for it, but they very rarely bring in any other dimension of why they shouldn't be serving. That I should say too, you're consistently saying, you see it consistently where they're telling other family members not to serve. And you see that all across the Civil War soldiery, but you see it an awful lot with the Irish, and a lot of that, and you don't see much animosity towards late war guys. A lot of it is because I think there's an acceptance. I might go to the war, but my two brothers aren't going to go to the war because somebody has to look after the farm and somebody has to look after the parents, and you need to have this kind of economic diversity that goes, and there's like a kind of an acceptance of that as well that goes on. So yeah, so I suppose no is the answer.
For a fascinating conversation. My question, you said I had no idea of the amount of Irish immigrants coming to the States in this period to enlist in the Army for economic reasons. With that, the draft riots in New York in 1861, my understanding was that the Irish in New York were protesting that they were being conscripted. The rich man could pay his way out, and the enslaved population, they were not free, so they couldn't be conscripted into the army. So if the Irish were coming to fight, what is this group that is fighting against being drafted? Or who is this group?
Well, I'm not an expert on the draft riots, which there's been a lot of good work done on the kind of, it's a complicated mix of stuff in relation to class, the war, rich man's war, poor man's fight and everything. Tyler Ambinder has done some phenomenal work actually on looking at the, there's virtually nobody drafted really, like they don't get drafted. But the perception, and I'll say this, and you see it all through their letters, there's a perception, and it doesn't matter what reality is, there's a perception, it just doesn't matter. I think maybe there was a bit of reality to this anyway. The Irish are writing letters saying, effectively, this is a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. I mean, they're saying it, more or less from the start. These are guys in service who believe in what they're doing and everything, but they're feeling exploited. And I think that's a big element of this. And like, we're all being sent off to the front to get killed, and the guy up the road is like, I think that ties into it a lot. I will say this, it's one of the reasons I keep reiterating about like the Irish Brigade and stuff. So we might look at the Irish Brigade and go, oh, well, the Irish Brigade got whacked at Fredericksburg and Antietam, so the New York Irish will be annoyed. But you look at the Second Battle of Bull Run, no major ethnic Irish unit on the field. New York units are annihilated in that. And it's still coming in to the 5 points and stuff like this. And again, I'll add this to the mix. You're an illiterate mother and you see this in the pension fund. What are they doing? They're getting a notification. So they're writing to their son and they're writing, sorry, I'm off. But they're writing to the son and they're getting all this correspondence in. They're bringing it to their tenement neighbor who's writing the letter for them, reading it out, all public. So every single one of those letters that comes back is amplified in a community. It's the entire block of tenements are invested in an individual. And so like, that's a clear issue, like if you're saying that you're being exploited. And so, yeah, so you have that dichotomy where you have the guys who are in service who are seeing it, there are people who have no intention of enlisting who feel it as well. But then, like, there are a different set of Irish, if you like, who are coming in, these others who are looking for the massive amounts of money. I mean, they're doing it here as well. They're not kind of impacted, I suppose, by what's going on in New York if you're coming direct from Cork or Galway with the express intent of enlisting, if you know what I mean. Yeah, I'm not sure if I've answered your question. I will say, like when the riots happened in July 1863, it's the first draft, right? And so the reality of what happens in the draft is that really nobody gets drafted, you know, proportionately speaking. People, if you didn't want to serve and you got drafted, you didn't serve. It was covered. And it's where the Irish come into their own in this is this substitutes, where you would be paid as a substitute. And so that's when I suppose everybody starts seeing the opportunities that are there if you're willing to do it in places like New York and coming from Ireland as well. Sorry, it was a bit of a roundabout way, but yeah.
Yeah, we're actually about out of time. I'm going to invite you all downstairs to finish the conversation there, if that's okay. And please grab a copy of the book, and thank you very much, Damien.
Thank you.